Good afternoon. My name is Mark Quenville, and I'm the Executive Director of Medical Information Network, North Sound, affectionately known as MINS. Our mission is to improve the quality of care for patients in our community by giving healthcare workers access to an aggregated community health record. I would like to thank Mayor Boudreau and her team, especially Kim Kleppe, for supporting municipal broadband. Mount Vernon Broadband has been a foundational tool for the success of our organization and the healthcare community we serve. Additionally, I would like to thank Congresswoman Del Bene for her support of federal grants which MINS has received to help us build out our healthcare network from Mount Vernon to the islands, to the east, and to the south. Thanks to Ms. Malarkey and the other speakers today who answered the call to participate in this important conference. When highly effective leaders are visionary, they have a keen awareness of trends, and they look beyond the present situation to enable change with the disruptive innovation. Such was the case in 2008, amidst the fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the local economy, the upcoming change in government, and the highly ineffective healthcare system. The founders of MINS broke the conventional wisdom of tightly controlling access to patient health information. Think about it. The leadership of the Skagit County Public Hospital Districts recognized the brokenness of the information silo model, intuited the future, and collaboratively created a local opportunity to incubate disruptive solution. Most disruptions have three enablers: a simplifying technology, a business model innovation, and a disruptive value network. It's not technically hard to connect Skagit Regional Health's electronic medical record with Island Hospital's EMR. And the visionary founders of MINS set up the innovative business model. What we are here to talk about today is the disruptive value network and how it creates economic development, better community care coordination, and ultimately a better lifestyle, which is why many of us chose to live here in the first place. With that in mind, I would like to introduce our next two speakers, Christopher Mitchell and Craig Settles, who will tag team the topic broadband as a vital economic tool. Chris is a national expert on community broadband networks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Craig is a nationally recognized consultant on municipal broadband as Director of Communities United for Broadband. Please give them a warm welcome.
Hello, everyone. Yesterday, I had some extra time, so the city of Seattle had two broadband discussions, one at lunch and an evening presentation in which they were talking about municipal broadband, and I gave a couple of presentations talking about a number of things. And after the second one, a gentleman came up to me, and you quickly determine when you're talking with someone, how technical they are and how much they understand of a topic, and it was immediately apparent that he knew what he was talking about. And he was very interested in how municipal broadband can allow better business-to-business services than Comcast does because of the way Comcast builds its network for a variety of reasons. And I started responding, and we were going back and forth a little bit, and if I could paraphrase his comments to me, it was, yeah, what you need to do is go up to Mount Vernon. So this guy named Kim has built this great network. And I said, yes, I was there yesterday, and I'll be there tomorrow. In fact, they've done a wonderful job. So it's excellent to see that word is spreading about the effort that's going on here. I'm going to go for about 15, 20 minutes, and then Craig's going to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to do Q&A. So there's some cards on your table. There's already been a few questions submitted. We may not get to them all, so make sure you ask really great questions to increase the probability that your question will be selected. I'm sorry, would you mind tilting the monitor a little bit so I can see that a little better? There we go. All right. So one of the reasons we're here is because of how incredibly important it is to have high quality internet access. Internet access is something that varies from community to community. For business services, it can be as much of a factor of 1,000 in terms of the prices. We don't allow that to happen with other key utilities, with other essential inputs into the economy. And I think there's good reasons for why it's sort of developed in this way, because of the way broadband sort of crept in as something that was just nice to have and slowly became essential to the economy. But we're dealing with this interesting point right now where it's really essential for businesses. And it's really great to be following the speakers this morning who set a great stage and noted that while higher levels of government are sometimes helping, I think communities really do have to rely on themselves. And that's a great message to follow. The chairman of the FCC has recently given us terrific talking points. He's come out and made the point that many people have been making for a long time, which is that we need better internet access. And over the past 2 weeks or so, he's been really making the point that most Americans only have access to one provider of 25 megabits per second or faster. And so we really see at all levels of government at this point an understanding that the existing solutions are not meeting our needs, and we need to do something better. So to plug ourselves at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we sort of saw this coming about 9 years ago. It wasn't me. I joined the Institute 7 years ago after the program was underway. But basically, we looked at communities and said, this internet thing's going to be really important, and under the current laws, local governments don't really have the capacity to require the existing providers to do a good job. They're not likely to get that capacity because we're seeing local authority moving to the state and federal level rather than the opposite direction, which frankly is where our policies tend to encourage it to be. And so we decided that the way that communities could make sure they had the networks they need was by owning them, because owners make decisions. And they could also work with cooperative approaches, which has been tremendously successful in rural areas, and I think may have some promise in some urban areas under specific situations. It's very difficult to create a new cooperative. And also nonprofit type solutions where the city may work with a nonprofit, or a nonprofit within a city may take on some of these responsibilities. All of those three solutions lead to networks that can meet community needs and probably will not be called Comcast in 5 or 10 years. Because companies like Comcast really grew by buying smaller local companies, family companies. And that's how they grew. And you have to recognize that. A lot of small businesses, a lot of small ISPs really do a great job. And a lot of them end up being centralized ultimately and consolidated. So we're tremendous supporters of what local businesses have done. And we're really supportive of places like Mount Vernon, where they find ways of allowing local ISPs to thrive. So there's about 400 communities that we're tracking that have service from a municipal network, a wired service, where some level of government, usually a local community government or a public utility district in this state, provides service to businesses or residents. Of them, about 150 are citywide, so Mount Vernon's in the majority of networks that don't quite touch every last resident and business. Many of them are growing. The 150 that are citywide, about half of them are older cable networks that were built in 2001 or earlier typically. Since then, they've almost all been fiber to the home networks, and there's about 80 or 90 communities that have a citywide fiber to the home network that is delivering a triple play service. There's about 20 states that limit local authority to do this to varying levels. The state of Washington limits the authority of public utility districts to only deliver wholesale services. So cities like Mount Vernon and Seattle and Tacoma, three that may or already have done something, have really no limitation. And so some cities like Mount Vernon have decided that the approach of doing a wholesale service is the best one for them. But in Washington, cities can decide which business model they would prefer to use. As a result of these state laws, we've seen efforts to really increase the authority of local governments. It's the cable and telephone companies that have really pushed them. So local governments have been fighting back, but at the state level, it's really hard to fight the kind of massive lobbying power of the big cable and telephone companies. particularly when it's really easy to kill a bill in a legislature. It's hard to get something through, particularly with the kind of language you might want. So there's a new effort that I'm a part of called the Coalition for Local Internet Choice. I bring it up here because we highly recommend people that are supportive of this decision being made at the local level. You can join it. You can go to the website, Local Net Choice. I kind of always get that messed up, but it's localnetchoice.org. And in the lower right corner, you can sign up for being a member and getting updates and that sort of thing. This is all part of the FCC right now is deliberating whether or not to modify two laws, one in Tennessee and one in North Carolina, that both limit the ability of very successful municipal networks to serve their neighbors. Both states have basically shut that down, whereas cable companies can serve anyone in the state. Municipalities are strictly limited as to where they can go. And their neighbors are really frustrated because right now we're kind of giving them taxpayer dollars for AT&T to expand UVerse and just slow DSL connectivity, rather than using zero taxpayer dollars to let the city of Wilson and the city of Chattanooga expand to bring high quality gigabit service to their neighbors. It's kind of puzzling, but that's politics today. The cities that do triple play typically have a municipal electric utility that has done it. And I'm gonna skip the long, really entertaining tirade I go through about how miserable it is to get into the cable television business. No one wants to do it. Cities have done it because they found that, particularly in years leading up to now, they found that it was absolutely essential to be able to have the network pay for itself, was to offer cable television. That model seems to be changing somewhat right now. And it's in the city of Longmont that we're all watching in Colorado. 80,000 people north of Denver, where they have a municipal government, also with an electric utility that's owned by the city, and they're doing just gigabit service. They're not doing telephone, they're not doing television. They're just delivering very high quality internet access at $50 a gigabit if you sign up early, and $70 if you don't. Well, $70 a gig is sort of a common price. We saw Google set that price, and a lot of other gigabit networks have followed on. So it's kind of a common price that we see. So cities that don't have electric utilities have followed in the model of Mount Vernon. Interestingly enough, Mount Vernon and Santa Monica started around the same time of having visionary people within local government who recognized what future needs would be, and they started planning for the future, often working very hard to convince their elected leaders that this was a very important investment, even if it was a modest investment of $80,000. An elected official doesn't see $80,000 as being a modest investment. They want to know, is that something that's going to come back to haunt them if they spend that money? Because voters hold local officials accountable for that sort of thing. Now, I wrote a big case study about Santa Monica, in part because that was the best example I knew of at the time, and only later did I come to learn about Mount Vernon, which is also very inspiring and has no case study yet from me, but we're working on it. So the key approaches here, as far as I understand it, is that it's incremental approaches that allow you to get fiber and conduit in the ground in times when the ground's already disturbed. So rather than tearing up the streets just to put fiber and conduit in the ground, you use other opportunities to get it in the ground, and you save 90 to 95% of the cost of doing it. Sometimes that really runs in the way of public works. I'll tell you frankly, many visionary CIOs are stymied by public works directors who say no. And depending on leadership of a mayor and others, that may stop a project. But the key point here is to recognize that cities can do a lot of things even without going into debt. Mount Vernon did not go into debt. Without taking out incredibly costly loans that may drive the business model then in ways that a city might not want it to. But the downside is it takes a very long time to connect everyone. Santa Monica has decided to start rolling out connections to some residential areas. The city of Danville, Virginia has been incredibly successful connecting local businesses in a very similar model to what Mount Vernon does. And I remember thinking to myself, because I was there 7 years ago, and I thought, this is a nice approach, but really you got to figure out how to do it all at once because it's going to take way too long. Well, a lot of the cities that went to try and figure out how to do it all at once have done nothing in the intervening years, and Danville has connected a ton of businesses and revived the area of Virginia that had the highest unemployment rate. and they are now starting to connect some residents. And there's still a question of at what point does it make sense if a city wants to do that. And some cities are very content just to drive that economic growth and to see what develops in the residential markets. Given the recent news from Q-Life, I just wanted to throw this in at the last minute. This network in the Dalles, down on the border, Washington and Oregon, decided to retire their debt 3 years early. They had done well enough with the network. And I bring that up because, and I'll talk about this in a minute, there's some municipal networks have not done well. And we're very candid about that. The vast majority of them have been successful and met their goals. But some of them have stumbled and some of them have really fallen. So you hear from industry claims that all municipal networks fail or they're all loaded down with debt. And we know that's not true here. They'll say that it's just too hard for cities to do. But you see that there's a number of approaches that are low risk, that can have big payoffs, that have worked out tremendously well. One of the networks that has not done so well is Utopia. And any city that thinks about doing this, that's in Comcast or CenturyLink territory in particular, will hear about Utopia. 14 cities in Utah that banded together to change the way the telecommunications market worked in the early 2000s. Very visionary people who suffered from a couple of bad management decisions, as well as some very tough and dirty competition, a lawsuit from Quest at the time, or US West even, state legislation that got in their way. A lot of problems has resulted in $500 million of debt that is owed by these cities. It's incredibly frustrating, I think, for everyone involved to see that. On the other hand, they've still generated a ton of jobs in the area. I just saw a story this morning about the bond rating of one of the cities involved is doing very well. It's an AA+, I believe. And they've had to raise sales taxes a bit to pay for it, which is not at all what they wanted to do. But when the industry says that Utopia is a horrible disaster, it's important to understand what that means. They're unable to pay their bills. And that is not the way the network was designed, and a number of elected officials have lost jobs because of it, because people are very frustrated that this was a network that was not supposed to use any taxpayer dollars, and now it has. On the other hand, it's really driven a lot of economic development, and it's retained businesses, because businesses that get used to the kind of networks that Utopia has, the kind of networks they have in Mount Vernon, if they start thinking, I'm going to look for a new location, they quickly realize that they have to stay within a Mount Vernon, because these kind of services aren't just available everywhere. And so I like to say that this is something that is very challenging for communities to do. It's a hard investment, but it works out in most cases when the cities are very serious. They do their planning and due diligence, and there's ways of mitigating the risk. But some cities have struggled, and we've learned a lot from them. Let's see. One of the other ways that we know that municipal networks have succeeded is because we've seen some studies. An interesting one is the GAO did a number of interviews to find out about the impacts of municipal networks and networks that received funding from the broadband stimulus programs, and found that the economic environment was far better. Faster services, lower prices, more reliable connections, and that sort of thing. They also found a candid assessment from one of the incumbents that basically admitted we wouldn't have invested more of our funds into this city to provide better services if not for the fact that the city built its own network and we had to compete with them. So it does drive more investment. As I said with Utopia, cities expect networks to pay for themselves, and I want to just spend a moment on this because the opponents of municipal networks will almost always talk about how it's not fair for the private sector to compete with taxpayer dollars, conveniently omitting just how much in taxpayer dollars they are gobbling up on a regular basis. Certainly true of the telephone companies, and the cable companies have benefited from decades of monopoly protection in many markets. So, first of all, even if there was taxpayer dollars being used in most of these markets, it's not at all clear that that would be a net advantage when you actually compare the advantages and disadvantages of different business models of public to private. Nonetheless, most communities have said, we are going to build our networks without using taxpayer dollars. So they, to the extent that they borrow, in cases that they do, they will borrow money from bondholders, in some cases backed by taxpayer dollars, and in other cases not. And so there's an argument, if it is backed with a general obligation debt, that's certainly there's some modest amount of taxpayer dollar assistance. However, the payments to bondholders are then expected to come from network revenues. So I think this is a rather clean approach that I do think is not appropriate to say that somehow cities have a tremendous advantage over massive firms when it comes to building networks and competing with them. But that reminds me, actually, I was going to ask this great question. And I'll tell you, this joke has failed more times than it's succeeded. But I love it. The question is, how do cities fund most of their networks? And the answer is bonds. So it's very indicative of my kind of humor. Other ways of financing it is loans, interdepartmental loans, in some cases grants, although my organization, myself, we tend to be very fiscally conservative, and we really don't like grants for the most part. We want networks that absolutely will pay for themselves and not require ongoing funding. I frankly think that USF is incredibly concerning. The idea that Universal Service Fund, the idea that you would build a fund that basically is expected to forever escalate, that's not a good approach. And I also think that there's a number of nuances that if anyone has questions afterwards, I'd love to talk about in terms of understanding that the real cost of building fiber optic networks is a one-time cost. The operating costs are very low. The upgrade costs are remarkably low compared to the kinds of infrastructure that cities regularly build. And so it's really figuring out how to do that one-time cost to get fiber in the ground, get an ONT on the side of a building, which is a magical device that provides a gigabit level of service, and how to pay for that, because a lot of times it's hard to pay for that right up front. You have to borrow money. And trying to pay that back, that's hard. And it's also why it's incredibly hard to provide high-quality service to low-income populations, which I think is one of the biggest and hardest challenges that we all face in coming years. Frankly, providing services to businesses that Mount Vernon has done a tremendous job of is comparatively easy compared to the challenge of making sure that every last person has an internet connection, so that their children, for instance, all have the same opportunity for the schools. And so I'm going to finish up by just noting, I hope I haven't gone too over it. My alarm was supposed to go off and warn me if I was going up too much. But the Mount Vernon is a part of a very exciting announcement that is going to come out on October 20th. We're doing an event in Santa Monica for this new organization called Next Century Cities. Next Century Cities is a group of mayors and CIOs across the country, from cities as small as Mount Vernon and as successful that have already built networks, to cities like Boston, it's in Massachusetts, where the city is trying to figure out what they want to do and how they can make sure they have the kind of services that Mount Vernon's already delivering to businesses. We have 31 cities already joined. And it's, it's, like I said, it's big cities: Kansas City, Portland, Austin, and San Antonio, both Google Fiber cities and prospective Google Fiber cities. Cities that have built some of the most successful municipal networks: Lafayette, Louisiana, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Wilson, North Carolina, and then smaller cities that have really done an incredible job and haven't gotten the attention that they deserve, because bigger cities are the ones that the media always wants to write about. It's just worth noting that we all owe a debt of gratitude to Google Fiber, because until Google Fiber came along, no one at the national media understood that we had a cable problem, that the cable internet wasn't the best thing we could do. And no one wanted to write about very fast networks until Google wrote about it. And as soon as Google issued press releases about it, the press started picking up on it. So even though I'm very concerned about the Google approach in terms of the long-term future, I think it's important to recognize how that's all come together to get us to where we are now. So I'm going to step off here, unless there's another slide. Nope. I'm going to invite up Craig, and I just want to say that when I got involved with this, starting to learn about what cities were doing, and I was very excited to join the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Craig had already published a book on it. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Thank you.